Today's video is sponsored by War Thunder. Weapons in anime, be they giant hammers, buster swords, or a pair of twins who turn into pistols, they are iconic. While they may not be practical or realistic, we still love them. In fact, an anime can be made or broken by whether or not it has cool weapons in it. Bleach is known for its Zanpakuto, Naruto is known for the 7 Swords of the Mist, and 7 Deadly Sins is known for the sacred treasures. See, the sacred treasures are the 7 legendary weapons wielded by the 7 deadly sins. Weapons that are instrumental in the strength of every single one of the 7 deadly sins members. However, the sacred treasures are a bit odd as far as legendary anime weapons go. You see, because while some characters are never seen without their legendary weapons, like Cloud with his Buster Sword or Kisame with Samehada, for large swaths of 7 deadly sins run, a lot of the sins don't have their sacred treasures, and therefore as readers or viewers we have a lot closer connection to some sacred treasures than we do to others. But just because a sacred treasure isn't around for the entirety of 7 Deadly Sins' run does not mean it is not powerful. And while the backstories and powers and how these weapons boost the abilities of the sin they correspond to are shrouded in a bit of mystery in the 7 Deadly Sins universe, today we're gonna be ripping that shroud away, because today we're talking the 7 sacred treasures ranked and explained. Yes, I have read all of 7 Deadly Sins. No, I'm not proud of that. But am I reading 4 Nights of the Apocalypse? No. But I do watch YouTubers explain what happened in it because I need to know everything. But before we get to talking about my problems, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to listen to me try and pretend that I know everything for an hour and a half at a time, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Before we get into all that, guys, today we gotta talk about today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the greatest vehicle combat game ever made, as it allows you to control over 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships in incredibly immersive vehicle-based PvP content. And you might be thinking, with that many vehicles, there's gonna be no eye for details. But every single vehicle in this game is modeled down to those minute details. And War Thunder is completely free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. And with one of the most dynamic and detailed vehicle damage models in gaming, since there's no general hit points, vehicles suffer from actual damage to their components and crew instead of just losing a little bit of your health bar. You'll see with something known as a damage X-ray the exact kind of damage that was either done to your vehicle or your opponent. The Japanese AH-1S helicopter Kizarazu can be purchased in-game and features an anime design actually used by the JSDF. Well, even though War Thunder does strive for historical accuracy, there are thousands of fan-made camouflages in the game, and tons of those camouflages are either in an anime style or show off anime characters, and you can download as many of these camouflages as you want for free. But outside of all of the incredible anime-themed camouflages that you can use to customize your vehicles, and all of these vehicles are displayed in incredible detail in 4K resolution with authentic sound effects and beautiful music, creating an atmosphere to fully immerse yourself in. But if you're trying to feel fully immersed, War Thunder has also added body pillows as a 3D object you can add to any of your vehicles. And you can receive these body pillows by following the link in my description. And following the link in my description will also give you 7 days with a premium account, 100,000 silver lions, and a 50% booster to XP and lions. So now not only can you be incredibly immersed into vehicle-based combat, but you can also be incredibly immersed into being a weeb. So the sacred treasures, what are they? How did the sins get them, and how do they boost the abilities of their respective sins? Well, like I said, unfortunately the history and the backstory of a lot of these sacred treasures is shrouded in a bit of mystery. There's a lot that goes on in the 7 Deadly Sins universe, and describing where these sacred treasures really came from wasn't one of the things they decided to dive that deeply into. But regardless, let's start this video off in the way that we tend to start these videos off. At the beginning, the sacred treasures, which are now obviously wielded by the 7 Deadly Sins, were originally treasures owned by the Kingdom of Leone, which is where the 7 Deadly Sins were originally assembled. But the monarch of the Kingdom of Leone, Bartolomeo, decided to give these sacred treasures to the 7 Deadly Sins so that they could achieve their highest level of power. But where did the Kingdom of Leone get these sacred treasures? Did Barta just have 7 legendary weapons that he was hoping 7 legendary warriors would eventually come to his kingdom to take one day? I mean, sort of, but also sort of not. See, all we really know about the creation of the sacred treasures is that a man by the name of Dubs created them. Now, Dubs is a famous craftsman from the Giants clan. Now, Dubs was alive 3,000 years ago. Specifically, he was alive during the Holy War. We know this because Merlin actually requested from Dubs that he create the coffin that the Ten Commandments were sealed in for a couple of thousand years. You know, the coffin of eternal darkness that sealed away the entirety of demonkind. Now, Dubs has popped back up in a couple of other pieces of Seven Deadly Sins media, like Cursed by the Light, the second Seven Deadly Sins movie, which are all canon, mind you. Actually, no, I don't think the first one is canon. But in this movie, we see that Dubs is being controlled by the supreme deity, you know, Elizabeth's mom. And under the control of the supreme deity, Dubs goes into the demon realm and just starts murdering demons, which Meliodas and Zeldris have to battle against. And it's in this movie that we see the true level of mastery that Dubs has over any weapon that he creates. And as Meliodas tries to use Lost Vein, a weapon that Dubs created, against Dubs, Dubs is able to turn it against Meliodas, showing that he has complete mastery over any weapon he creates, wherever it is and whenever he wants to. So if you ever try to use any of the sacred treasures or any of Dubs' weapons or creations against him, he can just render them completely irrelevant. Now, as to how these sacred treasures ended up in King Bartolione's hands, we're not entirely sure, but we do know from King, not King Barta, that King Bartolione was the person who gave the Seven Deadly Sins the sacred treasures. So somewhere down the line in the thousands of years that Dubs was alive, he was commissioned to make 7 weapons for King Bartolione that were eventually handed to the Sins. But just because the Sins were given these weapons doesn't mean they held on to them. In fact, after the 7 deadly sins were betrayed 10 years prior to the story, a lot of the sacred treasures that the Sins were given were lost, specifically 3 of them. Well, lost isn't technically the right word for all of the treasures, because Meliodas pawned Lost Vein in order to buy the boar's hat. Bond's Corchus is stolen by the Weird Fangs when he lets himself get captured 5 years prior to the story, and Diane just lost Gideon. We never get an explanation for it, but we do know that she regains it after winning a fighting tournament at Vizel. Well, Escanor, King, Gother, and Merlin never lose their sacred treasure. Now, losing your sacred treasure is kind of an issue, because as we learned from King, all of the 7 deadly sins can't achieve their true power without their sacred treasure, as King went so far as to compare his power without Chastiful to a cup, and his power with Chastiful to a lake. And while all of the 7 deadly sins are relatively strong without their sacred treasures, they are much more so with them. And this is good when you consider the fact that the sacred treasures can pretty much only be used by the 7 deadly sins. But in true anime fashion, the sins don't only just get stronger by holding on to their sacred treasures, but by understanding their sacred treasures, learning to work with their sacred treasures, and more importantly than anything, learning their sacred treasures release, which operates kind of like the Bankai of the 7 deadly sins universe, a weapon going to another stage that gives an insane amount more of power, but is very hard to maintain. And that's about all we know about all of the sacred treasures. However, we do know more about individual sacred treasures. So with no further ado, let's get into ranking and explaining every single one of the sacred treasures. And coming up in last place, and I know people are gonna be upset with this, we have Lost Vein.
Nick, what do you mean Lost Vein's in last place? It's literally wielded by Meliodas, and he's the strongest of all the 7 deadly sins.
You're right, it is wielded by Meliodas, and you're right, he is the strongest out of all of the 7 deadly sins. But that doesn't make Lost Vein as a weapon that powerful. We need to separate the wielder from the weapon. Listen, the Executioner Blade in Naruto is literally just a sword that can fix itself. However, you throw it in Kakashi or Zabuza's hands, and now it's very scary. Lost Vein looks like an ornamental short sword with a dragon emblem on the hilt, because Meliodas is the dragon sin of wrath. Now, this appearance can change when Meliodas enters something known as Assault Mode, which is essentially Meliodas using 100% of his demon power at the cost of all emotions and thoughts. And when he enters Assault Mode with Lost Vein turns red. Now, like we've already said, Meliodas pawned off Lost Vein until Merlin got it back from the pawn shop and gave it back to him, which he waits until Meliodas is like fighting against a giant monster and his sword breaks, and she's like, oh yeah, that legendary treasure thing? Yeah, I got it back for you. Now, while Meliodas is just substantially stronger with Lost Vein in his hand, the activation of his sacred treasure allows him to use Lost Vein's ability, which isn't full counter. This is a common misconception. Full counter is Meliodas' ability, not Lost Veins. It's just Lost Vein never breaks like a lot of the weapons that Meliodas tries to use for a full counter, and therefore it's the perfect weapon for him to use his full counter with. No, Lost Vein's ability is known as Jutsuzo Bunshin, which translates to physical clone. It's Shadow Clone Jutsu, essentially. It actually operates exactly the same as Shadow Clone Jutsu. See, Lost Vein grants Meliodas the ability to make up to 6 clones of himself. However, Lost Vein's clones don't operate exactly like Shadow Clone Jutsu. See, let's say that Meliodas' power level is 5,000. If he makes 1 clone, that clone's power level will be 2,500, half of his power level, which is how Shadow Clone Jutsu works. But where things change is when you create multiple clones. Let's say with that same 5,000 power level that Meliodas creates 5 clones. Now every single one of those clones' power level will only be 500, as they all evenly split half of Meliodas' power level. And technically, that's where Lost Vein's abilities end. However, Meliodas is objectively the perfect fit for Lost Vein, because every single one of the clones that Meliodas creates has the ability to use full counter. And why is that important? I'll tell you. Well, it may seem obvious that all of the clones being able to use Meliodas' strongest ability is powerful. The reason that Lost Vein is truly perfect for Meliodas is because that full counter doesn't use your power level. It uses the power of the thing you're full countering and sends it backwards. So let's say, hypothetically, Meliodas has a power level of 5,000, but he's battling against somebody with a power level of 50,000. If Meliodas makes 5 clones who all have a power level of 500, they can still use full counter, so long as they hit it. So since full counter can be used on those substantially stronger than you, making weak clones through the medium of Lost Vein isn't actually the end of the world. And since Meliodas' full counter actually makes the attack go back stronger, Meliodas can full counter to a couple of his different clones in order to amplify the attack and send it back. But just because Meliodas is the perfect fit for Lost Vein does not mean Lost Vein is a strong weapon. It just worked out well. But I mean, considering the fact that all of the 7 deadly sins are the only people who can wield their respective sacred treasures, you would hope it would work out well. Moving on, because coming in at number 6, we have the last of the sacred treasures to be revealed to us, Bon's Korchus, or Korachus. I don't know. I gave up on the anime and I read the manga. I don't really say the word out loud that often. Now, this weapon is a holy staff, broken into 4 separate segments, and on the end 2 segments, there are blades. And while in theory, it might just seem like big old nunchucks, it is much more than that. See, Bon, just like Meliodas, lost his sacred treasure and then had it brought back to him by Merlin. She's just in market tonight looking for anything that looks like a holy weapon. The holy staff, just like any of the other sacred treasures, pulls out Bon's latent potential, maximizing his physical and mental strength. But more than that, the holy staff also isn't bound by the ideas of physics, because not only can the solid staff sections lengthen, but the chain segments between the solid parts of the staff can distort their angle, meaning essentially that Bon can attack in whatever way he deems fit. Let's say hypothetically you believe you're out of range of the holy staff. Bon can increase the length of the solid section so that you are not. Or let's say you believe you're within range of the holy staff, but you believe you've dodged it. Bon can augment the chain section's bend in order to make sure that the holy staff does in fact hit you, meaning there's pretty much no way to predict where the attacks from the holy staff are going to come from, making it almost impossible to dodge, which is a problem when you consider the fact that Bon has been honing his body in purgatory for what seems to be years before getting it, making him incredibly strong, so being unpredictable, also not great. But the holy staff also has an activation, just like any of the other sacred treasures. However, the holy staff's abilities, super concentration, don't manifest as an actual ability. It's more of a passive buff for Bon, which raises his mental and physical capacities to such a level that he was able to wipe out thousands of Indra's spawn before they could get their hands on any innocent civilians. In essence, super concentration just makes Bon's speed and accuracy with his ability Snatch much higher, giving him the ability to rip hearts out of massive demons or out of thousands of people with relative ease. But enough with the small weapons, let's get to the big ones. Because coming in at number 5, we have Gideon, also known as Warhammer Gideon. That one I can say. I'm just realizing the bottom 3 entries on this list were all sacred treasures that were lost. But of all of the sacred treasures that were lost, Diane losing Gideon is the most perplexing, because Diane is a 30-foot giant who wields a hammer that's roughly the size of her. How do you lose a 30-foot hammer? And more importantly, how did the great people of Vizel get the hammer to their fight festival? Gideon probably could be higher on this list when you consider the fact that it's a 2,200-pound hammer, and anybody who's able to swing a literal 1-ton hammer could probably inflict enough damage to kill anybody. And for all intents and purposes, Gideon is legit. It's just that the rest of the sacred treasures are also very powerful. Gideon, outside of being a walking car wreck, massively boosts Diane's ability to control Earth. As obviously without Gideon, Diane controlled somewhat of an ability to control the Earth around her, which makes sense as that's an ability of giants. However, when she has Gideon in her possession, that ability to control Earth is multiplied many times over. In the anime and manga, we've seen her with Gideon do things like levitating an entire mountain, using things like the ground gladius, which creates a mountain-sized spike out of the ground to impale anybody unfortunate enough to have pissed off Diane, and other things like Mother's Catastrophe that allow her to make massive eruptions out of the earth. And while that alone is pretty good, I mean, that's basically all that Bond's sacred treasure does, Gideon has an insane activation skill known as Lightning Rod, which allows Diane to use Gideon as a lightning rod for any magic being launched her way. And by funneling that magic into Gideon and down into the earth, that magic is canceled, making Diane pretty much invulnerable to magic so long as she sees it coming and can react to it. However, Diane as a giant is very close to the earth as a whole, and the usage of lightning rod not only destroys the earth but also kills anything that magic is funneled into, and thus she tries to use his technique somewhat sparingly. After the big old hammer, we have something completely different, because coming in at number 4 on our list, we have the only out of all of the sacred treasures that isn't a physical weapon. Because coming in at number 4, we have the twin bow, Herit, which is the first of our sacred treasures to not be stolen or lost, but when we consider the fact that Gother just creates these bows using energy, I'm not entirely sure he is able to lose them. See, the twin bows are a pair of bows made by Gother using energy. However, the idea of twin bows seems a bit weird, right? Because one obviously needs one hand to hold the bow and the other to pull the drawstring. However, Gother's energy bows are pulled via magic, and therefore he can fire akimbo. And the list of abilities for the twin bows is kind of insane. See, Gother has the ability Invasion, which allows him to trap people in an endless loop of their own memories, as well as read the thoughts and memories of others. But in order to use his ability, Gother has to make physical contact with somebody. Yeah, not when he has the twin bows. The twin bows massively increase the range of invasion, with Gother now able to shoot energy bolts into people's heads that activate invasion. So as Gother is storming the beach of Normandy or something, he can simply akimbo evasion into anybody who is able to hit in the head with an energy bolt, immediately immobilizing and taking out of the battle anybody he hits. But it can get a bit crazier than that, because when Gother and Diane were having a little bit of a scuffle, Gother used the abilities of Herit and Invasion to put everybody within a 3-mile radius who had a power level of under 400 into invasion. Well, not necessarily invasion. We never got a confirmation of whether or not he placed them all in a loop of their own memories, but he made everybody within a 3-mile radius unconscious. But wait, there's more. Gother also has 3 special attacks with Herit. There is Jito Suibi mode, which has Gother resting one of the twin bows on top of the other in order to create a cross out of the 2 bows, which, since Gother is a doll, will cause him to immediately lock on to whatever target he wants, pretty much all but ensuring that any bolt he fires is going to place the person he wants to into invasion. And the second move is Tokusei Hani Kokudai, which is another one of Herit's special abilities that allows Gother to increase Herit's range, which is how he was able to knock out everybody within 3 miles of him. But it only gets really scary when Gother decides to use his combined technique, Celestial Arrow, which is a combined technique with King and Chastiful that has Gother using his bow in order to fire Chastiful as the arrow. But considering the fact that that requires an entirely different sacred treasure to pull off, I don't know if we can give that to Herit. But speaking of Chastiful, guess what's next? Chastiful, coming in at number 3. Listen, putting Chastiful at number 3 kind of put me in a quandary, and is still kind of doing it to me, because, and I'm going to give you a little peek behind the curtain here, coming in at number 2 is Rita. And I would argue that as a weapon, Chastiful might be more powerful than Rita, because obviously Rita is only powerful because of Escanor. Because like a large part of Rita's usefulness is the fact that it can absorb all of the heat from Escanor, but without Escanor, that's not really necessary. But at the same time, the symbiosis between Escanor and Rita kind of feed into each other in an endless endless loop of usefulness, and Rita being able to store energy and heat from Escanor allows Escanor to assume his daytime form during the night. But is that Rita's power or Escanor's power? And I decided to give that to Rita, so now we have Chastiful here at 3. But honestly, you could switch the two. Anyways, back to Chastiful. Out of all the sacred treasures, we actually probably know the most about Chastiful. So we know that Chastiful was forged from the sacred tree in the fairy realm. And the sacred tree we know is the tree that gave life to the entire fairy clan. And it not only protects the fairy king's forest, but also empowers all of the inhabitants of the forest. In fact, according to the Lady of the Lake, the sacred tree was actually the third child of chaos, being the youngest sibling to the supreme deity and the demon king. But as the supreme deity is supposed to represent all of the good in the universe and the demon king is supposed to represent all of the bad, the sacred tree was really born with no feeling, at least no feelings of evil. The sacred tree also chooses the fairy king. Whenever the sacred tree feels as though a new fairy king needs to take over, it gives birth to a new one, and therefore the sacred tree has given birth to Gloxina, Dahlia, and Harlequin. So creating a weapon out of a child of chaos is gonna make a pretty strong weapon, which is why Chastiful is probably the second most versatile out of all of the sacred treasures. See, Chastiful has 10 separate forms, and we're gonna go over them now. But before we do, we have to do the mandatory. This sacred treasure increases the sin who's using its power, because Chastiful increases King's ability, Disaster, which is a power shared by all fairy kings, which gives them complete and total control over life in death. Now, technically, this power is given to the fairy king so they can rule over all of the fairies in the fairy king's forest. But in simpler, more layman's terms, Disaster gives the fairy king the ability to either diminish or replenish the natural state of something. In the case of Bond's battle against Meliodas, he was able to turn a small scratch into a severe wound. And in the case of more natural things, King could either grow an entire forest or wither it down to dirt. And Spirit Spear Chastiful increases this ability in King. Now, when Chastiful isn't in combat, King has it in the form of a pillow that flies him around. And while this pillow isn't technically one of Chastiful's 10 forms, it can act as a shield. Form 1 is known as Chastiful. It's the most basic and standard version of Chastiful. It's a long, broad spear with a levitation ability that King is able to control so that it'll follow an opponent until eventually they are skewered. Form 2 is known as Guardian, where Chastiful takes on the form of a large stuffed bear that King can control. However, King can also just set this version of Chastiful to battle against an enemy for him, much in the same way that he can set Form 1 to home any enemy he wants to. And this Guardian will parry any physical attack coming towards King, or towards itself. However, since the Guardian is created from moss, it makes it immune to fire-based attacks, but it does also make it weak to ice-based attacks. Form 3 is Fossilization. This form turns Chastiful into a twin-headed spear that, if it makes contact with somebody, it fossilizes them immediately, rendering them immobile and rendered useless in battle like that. Form 4 is Sunflower, which causes a gigantic sunflower to grow out of the earth that fires light-based projectiles at all of King's enemies, which are able to wipe out mountains and entire forests. Form 5 is Increase, which sees Chastiful breaking into a swarm of knives, all of which individually King is able to control through hand motions. Form 6 is Yagdra Cloth, which turns Chastiful into a cloth that wraps around King, giving him 2 bladed gauntlets on his fists and a flower on his chest. In this form, not only does Chastiful protect King like a suit of armor, but also increases his speed and attack power, allowing him to melee opponents up close. The 7th form is Luminosity, which turns Chastiful into a ring of light that's able to illuminate whatever King needs illuminated. The 8th form is Pollen Garden, which creates a massive barrier around King that's able to stop any incoming attacks of even the highest order. And since the pollen in this Pollen Garden is actually pollen from the sacred tree, coming into contact with this pollen not only slowly heals you, but also rejuvenates you, as well as getting rid of any pain that you may be feeling. And that's actually it. We never see King use Form 9 or 10, though my favorite theories are that Form 9 is just a Glock. Now, technically, I kind of misled you earlier when I talked about the Yagdra Cloth, because the Yagdra Cloth has only ever been seen in the true spirit form, Chastiful, which is Chastiful's sacred treasure release, a higher version of Chastiful that is substantially more taxing on King. However, after undergoing this sacred treasure release, King's body is flooded with magic from the sacred tree. And before King got his wings, this flood of magic from the sacred tree would actually overwhelm him, and by the end of the fight, he would be exhausted. But now that King has his wings and has finally assumed the true role of Fairy King, he can use this true spirit form Chastiful as much or as often as he likes. And it wasn't actually until King fully developed his wings that he was able to use the 8th form of Chastiful, Pollen Garden, as well as also being able to use multiple different forms of Chastiful simultaneously. And obviously, with every new upgrade that King and Chastiful got stronger. And therefore, even though the forms of Chastiful didn't change, they got stronger individually, with things like Form 2 Guardian becoming so strong after King developed his wings that it was able to bind Zeldris, and Pollen Garden being so powerful that it was able to withstand attacks from Mael, one of the 4 archangels. Not to mention that Pollen Garden also has the ability to use something known as Seeds of Awakening, which can reverse any mind-affecting magic. But enough about the weapon that now that I've described in its entirety, I actually believe is substantially stronger than our number 2 entry on this list, because we have to talk about our number 2 entry on this list, Rita. I made the wrong choice, but you know what they say, never look back. So moving directly forward, we're gonna be talking about the one-handed axe, Rita. Now, Rita is one of the least practical out of all of the sacred treasures. It's been described as too small to be a two-handed axe, but too large to be a one-handed axe, poorly weighted, and just overall nonsensical. And for most people, that would absolutely be true. However, Escanor is not most people. See, while Escanor in his nighttime form isn't able to wield Rita, Escanor in his daytime form uses it as a one-handed axe. And while Rita, just like Gideon, might just seem like a really big weapon that really big people use to incur really big damage on any of their enemies, it, just like Gideon, is a lot more than that. See, Escanor has a grace bestowed upon him by one of the archangels, Mael, and that grace is called the Sunshine. Well, technically, it wasn't bestowed upon him by Mael. It was given to Mael by the supreme deity, but Gother turned Mael into Estarossa, and the grace sat unclaimed for 3,000 years until Escanor came around. And Rita is important to Escanor because of Sunshine. See, because of Sunshine, anytime that Escanor is in his daytime body, he is emitting a massive amount of heat. Heat that would completely melt and eviscerate everything around Escanor if he wasn't able to channel that heat into Rita. And Escanor can do a lot with this heat. One, Escanor can pump the heat from Rita into himself during the nighttime to maintain his daytime form, which allows Escanor to use the strongest version of his body really whenever he wants, which is massive. But he can also use Rita's release ability, Charge and Fire, which is a description of Escanor charging Rita with sunlight over the day and then firing it off in a wave of concentrated heat at an enemy, as opposed to just melting everything around him all the time. This release of light and heat is so incredible that onlookers believe that it's the actual sun itself. So because Rita gives Escanor the ability to maintain his daytime form if it's cloudy or nighttime, and also manifest massive amounts of light and heat that are able to melt away entire battlefields or blow away members of the 10 Commandments, Rita is, for all intents and purposes, the perfect weapon for Escanor. Unfortunately for Escanor, Rita operates like Thor's hammer in that he can call it to himself from anywhere and it travels to him at insane speeds. Therefore, if Escanor is storing up too much sunshine or he needs to enter into combat, Rita is never far away. And even though Rita may not look bigger than Gideon, it is the heaviest out of all of the sacred treasures. We don't have an exact weight for it, but it weighs more than 1,000 kilograms, which is what Gideon weighs. So the fact that Escanor can wield it with one hand should speak to his strength. But what's stronger than Rita? What's stronger than Chastiful? What's sitting at number 1 on this list? Well, that would have to be Merlin's sacred treasure, Morning Star Aldan.
What do you mean, Nick? We barely understand what Merlin's sacred treasure does in the first place.
And you're right. While we understand substantially less about Merlin's sacred treasure than we do about, let's say, Chastiful, there's pretty much nothing that Merlin's sacred treasure cannot accomplish. You see, Aldan seems to be the conduit with which Merlin casts her magic, which means that everything from Perfect Cube to Infinity doesn't happen without Aldan. But more importantly, I want to talk about Infinity. The Infinity is a magical power that Merlin channels through Aldan, which allows her to keep magical spells active until she decides to turn them off. Meaning, let's say hypothetically she captures somebody in a perfect cube. If she also uses Infinity, that perfect cube exists until she says it doesn't. Even if she dies, that perfect cube continues to exist. And Merlin can apply this to any of her magic, making enemies frozen in ice forever, having a fire burn for eternity. Merlin can even go so far as to stop time, which is why she doesn't age even though she's over 3,000 years old. Outside of that, Aldan boosts Merlin's telekinesis. It allows her to display locations that she's never been to in her all-seeing magical orb, and she's also able to transfer her soul into Aldan in order to reverse any status effects afflicted to her body. So let's say if hypothetically Gother was about to invade her body, she could simply send her soul into Aldan and avoid that attack entirely. The real reason that I'm putting Aldan at number 1 here is because we know fully that we haven't seen all of Alden's capability. However, when we consider the scope of magician that Merlin is, and the fact that Alden is instrumental in channeling all of her magic and amplifying it and making her the level of magician that she is, it seems pretty undeniable that her sacred treasure is the strongest of all of them. Though genuinely, if you wanted to put Chastiful or Rita at number 1, I wouldn't blame you. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with my rankings of these sacred treasures? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. A big shout out once again to today's sponsor, War Thunder, for sponsoring the video. Remember guys, if you use the link in my description, you can not only get the 3D object body pillow for all of your vehicles, you'll also be receiving 100,000 silver lions, 7 days with a premium account, and a 50% booster to silver and XP gain. There's never been a better time to get into War Thunder. The part of me is like, oh, I want this video to do well, but the other part of me knows if this video does well, I'm gonna have to reread the 7 deadly sins. I don't know if I'm up for that.